Grace, mercy, and peace to you from God our Father and from the Lord Jesus Christ. Houston, we have a problem. My sermon is not up here. And I don't memorize my sermon. Would somebody look in the basket back there and see if it's back there with the rest of the bulletins and so forth? Oh boy, I pity you people. Okay, well, we'll give it a go. And I'm absolutely, positively sure I'm going to get dry mouth through this because I am terrified right now. Anyhow, we are approaching Consecration Sunday. And we've done this for about the last 10 years while I've been your pastor. You've heard a lot of messages about stewardship and giving. But of all the messages that I've given you about giving for the last 10 years, I would consider this one to be the most important. And you've not heard it before, but I think as a congregation you're ready to hear it now. And so, again, I want to thank Pastor Robert Morris from Gateway Church in Houston for opening my eyes to this understanding of giving. And the title of this message is The Principle of First, a Test of Faith. This principle of first is something that runs through the entire Bible. From Genesis, the first book of the Bible, all the way through Revelation, there is this reiteration, time and time again, about this idea of the principle of first. And we see that in the first lesson that Lawrence read from Exodus. And when you think about it, this is kind of an odd lesson, really. You need to know a little something. Thank you for that. I am definitely going to need that today. You have to admit, it does seem a little odd. This whole thing about presenting animals to the Lord in the temple, breaking a donkey's neck, it just seems odd. But behind it, there is this idea that the first is important to God. And what we see in this is that if we know a little something about the way worship was done in the Hebrew temple, and if you know a little something about which animals were clean and unclean, this thing starts to make a little sense to you. The first thing that we see is that the firstborn of everything belongs to God. That's the first lesson that you get from this. It says, these are verses 11 through 15, I guess, but I really like the way that the New King James Version introduces this idea back on the second verse. It's very emphatic. And in essence, what it says is that the firstborn are mine. It uses that kind of emphatic language. As a matter of fact, in the New King James Version, mine is capitalized, so you get the sense that this is really important. The firstborn always belongs to God. The next thing that jumps out at you, if you know something about temple practice, is that clean and unclean in Jewish tradition, there is animal. Some animals are designated as clean, and some are identified as unclean. The donkey is an unclean animal. Did you find something? Yay! Just in case. I'm on a roll now. I don't need it, but so the donkey is considered an unclean animal, and it is to be redeemed. is what the word is in our text. Redeemed. It doesn't come right out and say it, but the clean animal, the lamb, is to be sacrificed. Okay? So that lead in from the second verse says, consecrate to me all the firstborn, whatever opens the womb among the children of Israel, both man and beast, it's mine. So all the firstborn belong to God, and because the firstborn belongs to God, they're to be consecrated. And it's the same way that we use that word consecrate in Consecration Sunday. It means they're set apart, holy, sacred. The clean animals are sacrificed. The unclean animals are redeemed. So the question then becomes, how do you know which is which? There's a whole list in Jewish writings in the Bible about which is clean and unclean. Even though the word sacrifice isn't used in our reading, any Hebrew who is understanding how this practice is being done recognizes that the lambs in the temple are sacrificial lambs. So there's two big things to take out of this reading. One, all the firstborn belongs to God. And second, all sons and all unclean animals are to be redeemed, and the firstborn of all the clean animals are to be sacrificed. I kind of hope you're getting a little ahead of me here. And you're seeing how this applies to us today. And if it's not crystal clear to you yet, let me just ask the question that's going to bring the whole thing into focus for you. Were you and I, after what happened in the Garden of Eden, were we born clean or unclean, spiritually acceptable or spiritually unacceptable to God?
Unclean.
We're unclean. We're unclean. We're spiritually unclean. Thank you, Adam and Eve, right? And if you want proof of that, I'll just ask the experts here, all the parents and teachers, do we have to teach our kids to be bad? No, it sort of comes naturally, doesn't it? We have to teach our kids to be good. Okay, so the second question then, was Jesus born clean or unclean? Clean. So you're getting a sense now that the clean had to be sacrificed so that the unclean could be redeemed. That's how it worked in the Old Testament, and that was just a shadow of what takes place post-resurrection. This is a powerful image for us to hang on to of this principle of first, but it doesn't stop there. There's more. That idea of firstborn also applies to the giving of first fruits. There's a connection there. Because in ancient Israel, there were a whole host of temple sacrifices that required the giving of first fruits offerings. If you look at Proverbs chapter 3, verse 9 and 10, it says, honor the Lord with your possessions and with the first fruits of all your increase. So your barns will be filled with plenty and your vats will overflow with new wine. Personal favorite of mine. But it's the idea that the first fruits offering is what God expects of his people. And then if you turn to Exodus chapter 23, it makes it kind of Earhart proof. It says, the first of the first fruits of your land you shall bring into the house of the Lord your God. And so for those of us that may be a little unclear on the concept, the Bible repeats first 2 different times. The first of your first fruits offerings you shall bring to the house of the Lord. The very first fruits of what we earn and what we have are to be brought into the Lord's house. This is fundamental to the life of people of faith. And notice that it says these things are to be brought into the house of the Lord. The tithe always comes to God's house, to the local place of worship. In other words, here. That's where the tithe goes. And second thing that we see is that the offering of those first fruits, they come from the very beginning of the harvest. That's what first fruits means. Do you ever wonder why? You know, Scripture doesn't say, take 10% after the fact and give me the 10%. That's 10% is the tithe. But it takes faith to offer the first fruits. It means trusting God to bring in the rest of the crop. It takes faith to give the first lamb of the season. Trusting God to continue to produce animals in the flock. And so, yes, this idea of 10% is important, but the real blessing comes from consecrating the first fruits of our lives and of our incomes. That's the biblical standard. And it doesn't call for us to wait until there are 10 lambs and then to give one, the one that's always in the garden eating everything out of the garden, the one that's we don't like anyway, the one that's malformed in some way. It's not good for anything else. And so it takes faith to offer that first lamb, trusting God's going to continue to provide for his people. And so, yeah, the real blessing in stewardship comes from offering God the first of our lives, the first of our incomes, not what's left over, if anything happens to be left over at the end of the month. And so here's the way this sorts itself out for us. If we pay the credit card company or the mortgage company first, trust me when I tell you, Visa and MasterCard, or Wells Fargo doesn't have the ability to bless your life and your finances. God does. And so the biblical standard of giving for God's people is for us to offer the first of our lives and our incomes, rather than what's left over at the end of the month. Just a quick word about our gospel lesson. Jesus tells this parable of the rich fool because his problem with this individual isn't that he's rich. It's that he only thinks of himself. If you read through the first 3 verses, the words I, me, my, myself appear something like 7 times in just 3 verses. Jesus has no problem with the fact that this fellow is rich. His problem is that the fool never gets out of his own head. He never thinks about sharing what he has with anybody else in need. He never worries about anything but his own situation. He's selfish in every sense of the word. It never crosses his mind that he might help somebody else. He could be talking about my generation, the me generation, right? One last thought for you on the importance of first fruits offering. Go back to the very first book of the Bible, Genesis chapter 4, the story about Cain and Abel. If you know that story, Cain is the firstborn of Eve. Abel comes along later. And so you'd think that it would be Cain and Cain's offering that would be first and foremost as far as God was concerned. But it doesn't work out that way. There's a switch coming. Let me read you the 4 verses that tell this story and just see if you catch what's going on with this. Chapter 4, verse 8 says, Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. And in the process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat. And the Lord respected Abel and his offering, but he did not respect Cain and his offering. So both brothers make an offering, but notice Cain's came in the process of time. And it was only an offering of the fruit. It wasn't a first fruits offering. But Abel brought the Lord the firstborn of his flock, and God respected Abel and his offering. And did you notice that it says both Abel, the person, and Abel's offering were respected? But God didn't accept or receive Cain's offering. There's a lot more that you could look at in the Bible about this idea of first fruits. And I'll just give you one last example and then we'll leave you alone after this. And this will be that last message about stewardship that you're going to have to deal with. But as Israel was coming into the promised land, they're told that when they conquer the city of Jericho, that all of the gold and silver from Jericho have to be consecrated and devoted to the Lord. All of it. And so we would ask, well, if a tithe is so important, why not 10% of it? And the reason is that Jericho was the very first city that the Israelites conquered when they got into the promised land. All the gold and silver were to be given to God. But the story goes that Achan, one of the Israelites, held some back. And because of that, the whole nation was cursed. The next battle they go into, they lose. Even though they were heavily favored, they outnumbered the enemy. It's only after that was held back, is returned to God, devoted to God, that Israel can continue then to thrive and grow in what was their new home. Jericho was the first town. So all of it, showing trust and faith in God, was to be devoted to God. And so I would just tell you, then as now, the people of God grow and thrive when we give back to God what is declared to be His by Himself. The clear message of Scripture is that the firstborn and the first fruits of our labor just belong to God. We're only returning to God what is rightfully His. God did His part when He redeemed us through the sacrifice of His firstborn Son. Let's just do our part in giving back to God what is already His. Amen.